In November 1989, two bands from Manchester appeared together on Top of the Pops, and it changed indie music forever. The MADchester sound was the unity of jangly guitars and thumping dance music. Big, psychedelic, even funky, and a perfect companion to ecstasy. Artists like the Stone Roses, Happy Mondays, In Spiral Carpets, A Guy Called Gerald, 808 State, and The Charlatans would bridge this formerly insurmountable musical gap. It is the story of punk and disco colliding, how Manchester became, for a brief moment, the centre of the musical universe, and why Bez is one of the most important figures in British music. This is before 1989, how Manchester became MADchester. Since the early 60s, Manchester has produced their own brand of rock and roll. Located inland east of Liverpool, theirs was a sprightly take on the Merseybeat sound, whether in Freddie and the Dreamers,
I'll be staying for many a day, I'm in love with you now.
Herman's Hermits,
Something tells me I'm into something good.
or slightly later with the Hollies.
Every morning I will see her waiting at the stop.
But aside from the Stone Roses taking the chiming guitars from the Hollies, as well as fellow jangle originators, the Searchers,
Still living together, needles and pens,
Beatles,
I think I'm gonna be sad.
and the Byrds,
Hey, Mr. Tambourine Man.
these bands had little impact on the later Manchester scene. A lot of elemental influences of what would become the scene's sound would come from the US. Sure, Elizabeth My Dear is a barely disguised rejig of Simon Garfunkel's Scarborough Fair.
Are you going to Scarborough Fair? Tell me apart and boil my bones.
And Happy Mondays stole a line from LaBelle's Lady Marmalade. But early 70s black funk was the groove-laden backbone of the Manchester sound, whether that be James Brown's funky drummer beat, showing up everywhere from Fool's Gold to Candy Flip's baggy redo of Strawberry Fields Forever. Or the raucous guitar play from Funkadelic, showing itself in the scene's more freak-out moments. The Northern Soul movement was also a factor. Starting in the late 60s, select clubs in the north of England, like Manchester's The Twisted Wheel, would hold themed nights where they would play a selection of obscure, up-tempo black American R&B and soul records.
Chicks are out of sight and I'm a-moving, yeah. I just gotta tell somebody, woman, I really love you, baby. I know you get
Running until the early hours of the morning to give themselves enough energy to dance non-stop, regulars would often consume uppers like Dexedrine. Growing in popularity throughout the 70s, Northern Soul's influence would rear its head in the 1980s. From Soft Cell covering scene staple Tainted Love,
Tainted love, tainted love, oh, tainted love, tainted love.
to Dexy's Midnight Runners' Whole Deal, Name and All.
This man was my father's, my Dexy's, my high.
As well as being the focus of The Fools' Lie Dream of a Casino Soul.
I just suppose this goes to show the live dream of the casino soul scene.
But most importantly, it culturally predisposed Manchester to dancing all night long with the aid of chemical stimulation, ready for the hacienda, acid house, and ecstasy. But Manchester as a cultural pop force began with one event. On the 4th of June 1976, the Sex Pistols played the Lesser Free Trade Hall in Manchester, 5 months before the release of debut single Anarchy in the UK. Only 40 were there to witness the first mercurial rumblings of UK punk. But many of the key players in the late 70s and 80s Manchester music scene were at this show, and energised by the Pistols' ramshackle energy, formed their own groups. The Pistols showed that you didn't necessarily need to know how to play your instruments to get up on stage. When the band returned 2 months later, due to the ensuing buzz, they were greeted by a sellout crowd. Pete Shelley and Howard Devoto, who had booked the original show, were early converts to the Sex Pistols, travelling to London to see them in February 1976. My life changed the moment I saw the Sex Pistols. I immediately got caught up in trying to make things happen. Suddenly there was a direction, something I passionately wanted to be involved in. They formed Buzzcocks soon after. Though musically rudimentary, their debut release, January 1977's Spiral Scratch EP, would be formative to the Manchester scene. Unable to find a record label to pay for their recording and distribution, they released it themselves on their own independent label, New Hormones, demonstrating to other Manchester bands that you can do it yourself. With Devoto on vocals, Boredom showed the restless energy of late 70s Manchester. The song's two-note guitar solo, proudly displaying the band's supremely limited musical ability. Would later be referenced by Orange Juice in Rip It Up. Soon Devoto would leave to form Magazine, and Buzzcocks continued with Shelley on vocals, producing Heart and Sleeve jangly sugar rushes. That would not only inspire the majority of pop punk, but also would, with their perennial lovelessness and gender-neutral ambiguity, preempt the Smiths. Also present at the Manchester Sex Pistols show were Peter Hook and Bernard Sumner, then of Stiff Kittens, later renamed Warsaw, and then finally Joy Division. Hook would buy a bass the next day. Alongside punk, the band took influence from German bands like Kraftwerk, Can and Neu, as well as Berlin-era Bowie and Iggy Pop, lending their music a rhythmic, mechanical sound, not unlike the industry of their home city.
Confusion in her eyes, it says it all. She's lost control.
As such, although soaked in dread, their music was supremely danceable. On their 1979 single, Transmission, Ian Curtis demands it of you. With their Enemy on side, their eerie, spacious debut LP, Unknown Pleasures, and the ominous, anguished croon of Curtis would make Joy Division, for a brief moment, the most important band in the country. But it wouldn't last. Curtis would take his life in May 1980, leaving behind a cult of devoted followers, and the rest of his band to continue on as New Order. Joy Division and New Order were signed to Tony Wilson's Factory Records, a Manchester-based independent, their sound moulded by oddball in-house producer Martin Hannett, both of whom were at the Lesser Free Trade Hall shows. Another early signing for Factory was the gothic funk of A Certain Ratio. Their October 1980 single Flight edged closer to the MADchester sound. Taking the atmospherics and space of Joy Division and adding chunky, grooving low end, creating a disco 12-inch suited for the end of the world. The last important post-punk group to come out in the immediate aftermath of the Pistol shows was The Fall, led by Marky Smith with an ever-rotating lineup backing him up. Along with punk, they mainlined the art rock stronk of Captain Beefheart and the left-field proto-punk of the Monks. The lopsided stomp of Totally Wired, a number 2 in the UK independent chart in September 1980, was a rare moment of accessibility.
Totally wired. I'm totally wired.
With Smith's erratic, drunk rant vocals, predating Shaun Ryder's similarly loaded delivery.
My heart and I agree.
Although the first blush of punk rock ostensibly broke the rules of what rock and roll had become, it retained much of the anti-dance, disco sucks attitude. It didn't take long for the slippery, taboo-breaking records of P-Funk and James Brown to mix with punk's newfound energy. Gang of Four, Ian Dury, The Slits, and others found a key element in the angular, chicken scratch guitar of James Brown guitarist Jimmy Nolan. And John Lydon's new band, Public Image Limited, gave Swan Lake a stripped-down funk beat. And called it, significantly, Deaf Disco. In the United States, especially New York City, the fusing of punk and funk was even more explicit, such as James Chance and his Contortion's 1979 track, Contort Yourself.
Contort yourself! Contort yourself!
An abrasive, hyperactive mix of rhythm and saxophone that welded punk fury to a skeletal funk beat. ESG split the difference, a US funky post-punk trio of black sisters who would record with Martin Hannett and play shows at the Hacienda. But with the track Moody would also be a staple in the Warehouse in Chicago and a precursor for house music. But few artists blended rock and dance music as successfully as Talking Heads. Cross-Eyed and Painless, from 1980's Brian Eno produced Romanian Light, was two chords in a groove that infused punk energy with Fela Kuti inspired dance rhythms. The track established the psychedelic capabilities of dance music, capabilities that nourished and defined the musical core of what MADchester would become. After Funky Town, it was widely assumed that disco was dead, but it simply evolved. The Chicago club scene took its danceable basslines and beats and started forming house music, while British pop groups like Duran Duran and Spandau Ballet would take the restless bass and staccato guitars of Chic. And score hits with their post-disco Girls on Film. And chant number one, I Don't Need This Pressure On. But not all of the European artists that fed into MADchester's DNA were polished megastars. Proto-indie favourites Orange Juice surprised everyone, including themselves, when they besieged the top 10 with Rip It Up in March 1983. Melding old and new, it took their usual Nile Rodgers styled guitar play and affixed it to a squelchy synth bass line. Achieved with a Roland TB-303, a recurring character in this story. Edwyn Collins' vocals are both suave and unpolished. And compared to the hyper-produced examples that otherwise dominated the charts, refreshingly down to earth. Rip It Up proved that one needn't be larger-than-life media figures to get people to dance. Collins attributed Rip It Up's success to regaining something of the old Postcardian positivism. Postcard Records, a tiny independent label that was started in Glasgow by one Alan Horn, sought to release catchy, joyfully amateurish singles by local boys Orange Juice, Aztec Camera, and Joseph K.
It's kinda funny.
Postcard lasted little more than a year, closing up shortly after Orange Juice signed to Polydor Records. As with so many micro-labels of the era, Postcard's influence vastly outstrips its sales, especially on the indie pop C86 movement. MADchester wouldn't have existed without the Hacienda. Started in 1982 by Factory Records mastermind Tony Wilson and factory artist New Order, the club played an indispensable role in not just the careers of many of MADchester's biggest acts, but of the creation of the MADchester sound itself. But the club and the scene wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for one song. New Order's Blue Monday, released in March 1983, actually lost money in its initial run, despite peaking at number 9 in the UK singles chart. The problem was not its popularity, but its artwork. The record came packaged in a die-cut sleeve, made to look like a floppy disk. It was so expensive to produce that, according to Tony Wilson, Factory lost 5p on every copy produced. But Blue Monday's impact on dance music, not just in Manchester, but the world, made New Order one of the decade's hottest acts. It was that rush of fame, or rather the money that came with it, that not only made the Hacienda possible, but it kept it afloat financially in the early years. Basically, New Order had started earning money at Factory, a lot of money. If they hadn't earned that money, they would not have had the freedom to do anything. And that's where the Hacienda came about. The track's influence went far beyond mere finance. It may have peaked at number 9 on the charts, but it sold steadily, eventually becoming the biggest selling 12-inch of all time, with all of the mainstream influence that implies.
How does it feel to treat me like you do?
Blue Monday fused synth-pop, post-punk, and club-centric dance music in a way that allowed post-punk artists to lay a credible claim to the dance floors of the world. It provided a virtual blueprint for every other dance-oriented pop act of the last 40 years. And it provided MADchester with not just the precedent for its baggy beats and broad pop hooks, but with a club it could call home. Even the term MADchester was coined by Hacienda factory head Tony Wilson. The last person of note to be at that pivotal Sex Pistols gig was a 17-year-old Stephen Morrissey. 6 years later, he would join up with guitarist Johnny Marr, bassist Andy Rock, drummer Mike Joyce, and form The Smiths. For British independent music in the 1980s, The Smiths were quite a big deal. Some might say the biggest deal. Signed to Rough Trade, the band would earn, an unheard of for an indie band, 15 top 40 singles in 4 years, starting with October 1983's peppy, ambiguously phrased, This Charming Man.
Punctured bicycle on a hillside desolate.
Written by Marr to outdo Aztec Camera's Walk Out to Winter.
Walk out to winter, swear I'll be there.
With its relentless bass line, it was a jangly girls on film for those that didn't share Duran Duran's sexual appetites.
I would go out tonight, but I haven't got a stitch to wear.
Performing on Top of the Pops, Morrissey wielding a gladioli struck a chord with the nation's youth. An indie band that didn't shy from populism, post-punk without overt masculism.
This charming man.
Especially for a band from working class Manchester, this was revolutionary. Said Noel Gallagher, "None of my mates liked them. They were more hooligan types. They came into work and said, fucking hell, did you see that on Top of the Pops with the bush in his back pocket? But I thought it was life-changing." Not only were they enemy darlings, but they were enemy darlings from Manchester. As such, other Manchester bands followed in their image. Though formed in 1982, James would get their first big break supporting the Smiths on their 1984 Irish tour. Summer Song from their 1986 debut Stutter would show the effect the band had on them, all chiming guitars and footloose rhythm.
They just destroyed me.
But the Smiths' jangled influence would emerge elsewhere as well. The Enemy had released compilation cassettes before. Their Class of 81 tape had been many indie kids' first taste of orange juice. But none had the impact of C86. Available via mail order from May 1986, the tape was Enemy's attempt to conjure their own musical movement, collecting together 22 tracks from the nation's many independent labels. Most would conform to the Fey guitar pop mode. Included within were the chiming 85-second heart rush of Primal Scream's Velocity Girl,
Here she comes again.
the shambling Buzzcocks pastiche of the Soup Dragons,
There's nothing I'd rather do than be with you.
and the twee power pop of the Pastels
Breaking hearts and breaking time.
and Shop Assistants.
There's no chance of happiness, it's up to you.
10 years after Anarchy in the UK and Spiral Scratch, it was the DIY spark of punk for a new generation. This was the time of Dire Straits and the launch of the CD, and everything being pristine and perfect. But with C86, you just had to pick up a guitar and make music imbued with enthusiasm. The cassette also codified the idea of indie music in Britain. Before, it referred to the breadth of independently released music from non-major labels. After C86, indie music was shorthand for jangly, lo-fi power pop that sounded not unlike this charming man. The C86 sound, that was indie. Primal Scream and Soup Dragons would move on from that sound, becoming baggier in time for the 90s. But at least one Manchester band was paying attention to all of this. Released in May 1987, the Stone Roses' jangle pop second single, Sally Cinnamon, could have easily sat beside the Pastels and Primal Scream on the comp.
Sally Cinnamon, you're my world.
But with a more funk-indebted bassist, they could really be something special. House music had been bubbling under in the Chicago black gay club scene since the beginning of the 80s. DJs like Frankie Knuckles and Ron Hardy distilling disco records down to the most danceable elements, the up-tempo beats, the bass line and the vocal hook. Primarily a club-based experience, the first commercially released house record wouldn't appear until 1984, with Jesse Saunders' On and On. More underground hits would follow. In the same way C86 had inspired a generation of indie bands to pick up guitar, the low musical barrier for entry and the lowering cost of equipment attracted many to create house music. The squelching, gradually evolving bass line of Future's acid tracks came about due to their second-hand Roland TB-303 not having an instruction manual. DJ Pierre experimenting until it sounded right.
Instead of trying to program it, I just started turning knobs. I was like, ugh. And he's like, well, what you doing? I'm like, I'll turn these knobs. He said, keep doing that. I'm like, I'm turning the knobs. And we just sitting there for like 30, 40 minutes. I'm just turning knobs and like, yeah, I like that, I like that.
Released via Trax Records in 1987, it would introduce the UK to acid house. At the same time, with the UK's more prevalent club scene, house was threatening to go mainstream. Chicago track Jack Your Body by Steve Silk Hurley shot to number 1 in the UK charts in January. And British producers wanted a piece, resulting in Pump Up the Volume by Mars in August 1987.
Pump up the volume, pump up the volume, pump up the volume, dance, dance.
Mars was an uneasy collaboration between indie label 4AD artists, Colorbox and AR Kane, with a scene-stealing scratch and sample mix by DJs Chris CJ McIntosh and Dave Durrell. As such, Pump Up the Volume features a bevy of interpolations, the title hook coming from Eric B. and Rakim's I Know You Got Soul.
As you hear it, pump up the volume, dance with the speaker till you hear it blow.
In addition to the bar keys, Criminal Element Orchestra,
Put the needle on the record when the drum beats go like this. Put the needle on the record, put the needle on the record, put the needle on the record when the drum beats go like this.
and Stock Aitken Waterman. The latter sample would get a couple of legal suits thrown at the track as it was climbing the charts by producer Pete Waterman, being quoted saying it amounts to wholesale theft. Despite this, Pump Up the Volume would hit number 1 in the UK in September, knocking Stock Aitken Waterman production Never Gonna Give You Up off the top spot. There's a generation that grew up in the clubs, probably because of the death of the live music market. Pump Up the Volume reflects that generation. The success of Pump Up the Volume would spawn more UK independent house acts, aiming for pop hits, including Theme from S Express, and Beat This. By 1987, Chicago house DJs like Frankie Knuckles were performing at club nights at the Hacienda. At the same time, Britain was starting a love affair with MDMA or ecstasy, a stimulant that resulted in feelings of overwhelming euphoria. This, combined with illegal outdoor raves, signalled what would become the second summer of love, as thousands of loved-up clubbers sought out warehouses and fields to dance the night away amongst strobes and thumping acid house beats. But as US acid house record imports were so expensive, Manchester would soon be producing its own rave anthems. Using a TB-303 and a TR-808 drum machine, Mancunian b-boy and formative member of 808 State, Gerald Simpson would put out the squelching, tweaking Voodoo Ray under the name A Guy Called Gerald in 1988. Using the voice of amateur soul singer Nicola Collier, Simpson was able to achieve the hypnotic vocal hook by sampling, stuttering, and flip reversing it. Additionally, he sourced its repeated tribal chant and title from a Peter Cook and Dudley Moore album. I always wanted to use this Derek and Clive skit, Bo Dudley, but there wasn't much memory in the sampler, so when Peter Cook said Voodoo Rage,
in her sort of voodoo rage,
it came out as Voodoo Ray. It was serendipity, poetry in a way. The initial 500 copy pressing of Voodoo Ray sold out in a day, soon becoming one of the most played tracks at the Hacienda of 1988. It would then be re-released in 1989, making it to number 12 in the UK charts. It is now considered the first UK acid house single. Although musical trends can come and go in an instant, a genuine sea of change in music takes its time spreading out. After leaving The Clash, then co-founding and immediately leaving General Public, Mick Jones formed Big Audio Dynamite. While The Clash had always been at the forefront of bringing soul and dance music into the punk idiom, Jones, along with co-founder Don Letts, dove headfirst into post-hip-hop, electronic dance music. Their second single, 1986's E=MC², was written as a tribute to the films of director Nicholas Roeg, and featured a liberal helping of samples from Roeg's film Performance.
Why don't you play us a tune, pal?
I don't like music.
Why don't you play us a tune, pal?
I don't like music.
You know, I don't think I'm going to let you stay in the film business. You know, I don't think I'm going to let you stay in the film business.
The track was a hit, peaking at number 11 on the UK singles chart. But more importantly, one of punk's original pioneers was in the charts with a band that was built from the ground up to make modern dance music, with modern electronics and modern methods. 4 years after Blue Monday had changed the post-punk indie landscape, that most indie of all indie bands, Manchester's own The Fall, had a dance hit. Hit the North was a danceable groove built on 2 Gentle Giant samples, and Fall leader Marky Smith's stream of consciousness lyrics about hitting the North. The track made it to number 57 on the UK singles chart, a rather high placing for such a stubbornly underground band. Naturally, Smith was unimpressed, saying that any idiot can get on the pop charts in Britain. In Manchester, we know that acid house was as big a youth explosion as punk, and was as colourful and wonderful and exotic. Everyone is now slowly beginning to understand that Shaun Ryder is the Johnny Rotten of acid house, and that is why people went nuts when he came on the stage. With their second album, 1988's Bummed, Happy Mondays soaked up the acid house and ecstasy that comprised the hacienda scene, and applied it to their white psychedelic funk. Most glaringly, lead single Wrote for Luck was written by Paul Ryder, failing to recreate the sequence bass lines of Chicago House on his bass guitar. Wrote for Luck's attempt to be a guitar-based acid house tune was aided by 2 dance remixes, a thumping, squelching Vince Clarke redo, and a Balearic beat version by superstar DJ Paul Oakenfold. Commercially released a year later, the remixes pushed the track into the UK Top 75. Getting dance remixes would continue to be a trend within the Manchester and Baggy scenes, and the Mondays would get Oakenfold to produce their follow-up LP, Pills and Thrills and Bellyaches. As well as comparisons to Johnny Rotten, frontman Shaun Ryder was hyped by Tony Wilson as a psychedelic W.B. Yeats, though with Marky Smith's lopsided delivery. Ryder formed spaced-out nursery rhymes, with melodies half dreamt and half stolen from Motown and the Beatles. Half the time I was more concerned with how the words were sounding than with what they actually meant. But the Happy Mondays' most essential element didn't appear on their records. Mark Berry, aka Bez, joined the group not long after their formation, Shaun inviting him up on stage as a way to deal with his nerves. Though armed with a pair of maracas, his main purpose is to dance, his often bizarre movements acting as a metronome, prompting the crowd to join in. If anyone best represented Manchester, it was Bez. If C86 was an indie call to arms, that all you needed was a guitar, Bez showed that you didn't even need a guitar to be part of this, just an E and a desire to dance. The fact that the band were willing to sell you that E only added to the band's overall importance to the scene. And to bring the whole thing full circle, New Order started to show signs of being influenced by the scene they helped bring into the world. Fine Time, the lead single of their 1989 album, Technique, had a strong acid house vibe. Perhaps fittingly, Technique was not only New Order's last album with Factory Records, it was arguably Factory Records' last significant release. However, by this time, other MADchester guitar groups had discovered dance music. Formed in the suburb of Oldham in October 1983, it would take 5 years for Inspiral Carpets to reach the national stage. The garage band blast of drums and organ that was their debut single, Keep the Circle Around, was named DJ John Peel's best single of 1988. But then things collapsed. Their label, Red Rhino, went bankrupt, their singer left, and a label dispute effectively made the band homeless. They would advertise for a new singer via an instrumental performance on Tony Wilson's The Other Side of Midnight show. Ending up with Oxfordshire lad Tom Hingley. The Inspirals were in some ways better known by their t-shirt designs than their music. Their iconic cow and cool as fuck tees far outselling any of their actual records, showing the cultural impact of the MADchester scene. Only 2 years after Keep the Circle Around, Inspiral Carpets were headlining Reading Festival, helped by era-defining singles like the 808 State-produced Joe, and the starkly affecting This Is How It Feels.
Husband don't know what he's done. Kids don't know what's wrong with mum.
While Shawn Ryder's lyrics dwelt within a heightened surrealism, This Is How It Feels shows the effect of depression and suicide on a community.
There's a funeral in the town. Some guy from the top estate.
A rare moment of abrupt kitchen sink realism in a very altered scene. From the shoegazy opener I Wanna Be Adored, to freak out jam closer I Am the Resurrection. The Stone Roses' eponymous debut was the result of 5 years of being overlooked in the Manchester scene, bleeding arrogance and pushing forth anthems. Much has been made of the Stone Roses' dance rock fusion, but in reality they were another jangle pop band in the lineage of the Smiths. And though you can't discount the swagger infused by new bassist Manny, their baggiest moment would happen later. The Roses' sound pulled from the best of British, melodies from the Beatles, the grandiosity of Led Zeppelin, and the attitude and anti-monarchy sentiment of the Sex Pistols. MADchester's political consciousness is often lost in a sea of ecstasy and acid, but the blissful Bye Bye Bad Man was inspired by the French student riots in May 1968. Singer Ian Brown had met an old revolutionary while backpacking across Europe, who still always carried a lemon with him to counteract the effects of tear gas. The French flag and lemon slices on the album's cover reference this song. Not to say that the Roses were all egotism and anti-establishment. I Am the Resurrection started with Manny fucking about with Paul McCartney's bass line from Taxman. Manny would play the riff backwards during sound checks, and we played along over the top for a laugh. Finally we said, let's do this joke song properly and see what happens. Released in May 1989, the success of their debut album wasn't an instant thing. Critics weren't 100% sold. It took The Enemy 5 months after its release to put them on the cover. Single She Bangs the Drums only just made it to the top 40. But by the end of 1989, the Roses had taken the throne for themselves, not from Elizabeth, but from Morrissey, and set the template for Britpop. Named after the Roland TR-808 drum machine, 808 State, alongside their former member, a guy called Gerald, were the first British acts to get their head around acid house. An aborted pill session resulted in the State's biggest track, Pacific in its many incarnations. Pacific State from mini-album Quadrastate, Pacific 202 present on album 90, but Pacific 707 would be the one that became the pop hit. With its birdsong ambience, excessively active Roland 101 bassline, and that 4-note saxophone hook. The track would dominate the Hacienda in the summer of 1989, even making its way to the Isote clubbing capital of Ibiza. It was here that Radio 1 DJ Gary Davies heard it and put Pacific on daytime rotation. By December 1989, it will reach number 10 in the UK charts. That month, 808 State would release the album 90, the first acid house album to chart in the UK, proving that the genre was no mere fad and could work beyond a 12-inch into a more long-form context. Three years on from Velocity Girl, Glasgow's Primal Scream had shifted things up. Their eponymous 1989 second album had taken influence from US garage rock like The Stooges and MC5. Though louder, faster and more distorted, critics contended that frontman Bobby Gillespie's voice was too brittle for full-blooded rock and roll. Most being less than enamored with the album. One person who did like their new direction was DJ Andrew Weatherall, noting in the Boy's Own fanzine his love for the LP's psychedelic ballad, I'm Losing More Than I'll Ever Have. Alongside being a rock and roll band, Primal Scream were partaking in club culture, so a collision of the two was felt might be an interesting experiment. Assigning Weatherall the track to remix, his initial attempt proved too reverential to the original song, merely adding an alternate kick drum track. It was Andrew Inez, Primal Scream guitarist, who told him to do it again, and just fucking destroy it. That's how Loaded came into being, basically. We gave him free reign, and he went for it. The result was February 1990's Loaded. A 7-minute indie dance hybrid that had more in common with Sympathy for the Devil than the Scream's original track.
Made damn sure the pilot washed his hands and sealed his face.
Weatherall using only a 7-second sample with which to create something completely new. A dreamy psychedelic tribute to Getting Wasted, and a forever staple of indie disco. At the end of November 1989, Happy Mondays and the Stone Roses both appeared on the same episode of Top of the Pops. Happy Mondays were joined by Kirsty MacColl for Hallelujah at number 30. Stone Roses' Fool's Gold had entered the chart at number 13. Most consider this the moment that MADchester went from a localized movement to firmly implanting itself into the national consciousness. Something was happening. Soon other Manchester bands with indie dance sensibilities would break through. Happy Mondays would momentarily blow up in the US, gaining a Billboard Mon Rock #1 in 1990 with Kinky Afro. While New Order would one-up them by scoring a UK #1, joined by the England football team, with their 1990 World Cup anthem, World in Motion. Baggy bands across the country would also join the indie acid house lovin'. The Farm, Flowered Up, Jesus Jones, EMF, the Soup Dragons, and the Mock Turtles. However, the MADchester moment would become short-lived, burning out quickly as its main bands faltered, and as US grunge began to rule the rock sphere. Happy Mondays split in 1993, and the Stone Roses disappeared, not returning until Britpop had taken over in 1994. Factory Records went bankrupt in 92, while the Hacienda closed after years of spiraling debt in 97. This 24-hour partying just wasn't sustainable. But their combined impact on indie music is sizable. Two of the biggest bands of the 80s would give the baggy sound a go. U2 with Mysterious Ways, and The Cure with Never Enough. During its rise and immediate aftermath, Manchester bands The Verve, Doves, and Chemical Brothers would form. But Manchester's biggest impact was on Britpop, as well as Blur adopting the sound on their debut album. One Noel Gallagher would get his first taste of the rock and roll lifestyle, roadieing for In Spiral Carpets. In terms of record sales, Oasis with the band Happy Mondays and the Stone Roses Wish They Could Have Been. Plus the acid house experiments of A Guy Called Gerald and 808 State prepared Britain for electronic dance music to become one of the dominant forms of pop in the 90s. Even today there are glimmers of that Manchester DNA in Kasabian, Reverend and the Makers, the 1975, the Cortinas, Blossoms, and Peace, as well as the hundreds of bands since that have tried to gel indie and disco. And it all started with Ian Curtis demanding that we dance, 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 dance to the radio. Thanks for watching. So what Manchester tracks did I inevitably miss? Let me know by commenting down below. To listen to all the songs featured, there's links to Apple Music and Spotify playlists on my Patreon. You don't have to contribute, it's just on there. I'd also like to thank whoever gifted me the Stone Roses debut from my Amazon wishlist. You have my eternal gratitude. Also, I'd like to shout out this month's new top tier supporters over on Patreon, Bron Chatwood and Josh Nicholson. And I'll see you in 4 weeks' time for something new.